Hello and welcome to the first episode of our new podcast, Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
I'm Sam Wang, Professor of Neuroscience and Molecular Biology and co-founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
So, Sam, today I wanted to talk about this issue that seems to be on everyone's mind, Democrats and Republicans, and that's whether in this election, we might be looking at a landslide victory, the kind we haven't seen in a while, both in the presidential race, but maybe even in the congressional races. And the one election people talk about, including myself, is 1964, when Barry Goldwater, the Republican senator from Arizona, faced off against President Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater famously said extremism in defense of liberty is no vice and moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. And the election went horribly for Republicans. Goldwater was devastated. And so Johnson came out looking like he had a mandate to do what he wanted. And then Democrats did very well. In the House, they had 295 seats. In the Senate, they had 68 seats. The balance between the Southerners and the Northerners tilted to the liberal part of the party, and then the Great Society would flow out of that. And so it was really a kind of election we haven't seen in a while. They used to be more common. And so I guess what I want to talk about today is what you think. If this can happen again, if Donald Trump is so exceptional that he might shake up the electoral map, what do you think?
Well, let's see. I guess 1964 was interesting because at some level, you're right, it's a benchmark for how lopsided an election can be in modern times. If I remember correctly, Goldwater ended up with, I think, 38% of the popular vote, and his slogan was, in your heart, you know he's right, and the counter slogan was, in your guts, you know he's nuts. But this year, one thing that's really struck me as a little bit surprising is that, so where things are now is that it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton is ahead. In the popular vote, it looks like she's ahead by 6 or 7 percentage points. If you look at the Electoral College, it's like the race is a little bit closer because it turns out that Trump's weakest states are deep red states. But all in all, what's sort of surprising is that things are kind of close-ish. So I was just looking at the numbers this morning, compared with today's polls right now, the current polling snapshot shows her winning about 320 electoral votes out of 538. To Donald Trump's 218. And so if you look at that, polls would only need to shift by about 4 percentage points across the board to even up the race. And that's, again, pretty close. And I think part of it is that it turns out that Trump is weak, but he's weakest in deep red states where the weakness doesn't matter quite so much. The swing states, I estimate that there are about 14 swing states. If you go over to election.princeton.edu, you can see what those swing states are. And of the swing states, surprisingly, Trump is actually pretty competitive in Pennsylvania, which is a classic swing state. And it looks like whatever it is he's purveying, voters in Pennsylvania like it about as much as they liked Mitt Romney 4 years ago. And so all in all, I would say personally, I would be, given where things are headed now, I would be a little bit surprised if Trump got anything lower than about 42% of the popular vote, which is substantially better than Goldwater.
Yeah, that's kind of incredible. I mean, the similarity between the two of them is they're seen as unstable by some and not necessarily trustworthy to have the job. Goldwater was obviously big difference is Goldwater was seen as right of center, and there was no way he was going to compete in other than Southern Democratic states. Whereas, Trump, I guess, could potentially have the ability because of these economic issues on free trade to make a play for places like Pennsylvania or maybe Ohio or something. So that seems to be a difference just in the candidates too, not just in the electorate.
I guess my take on that is that the interesting thing about the way you're describing it is you're, not to state the obvious, but you're describing the campaign as if it's a normal campaign. So the candidate's going to make a play for the swing states and running strong. And, and those are certainly things that we're used to hearing about. But I just want to point out that there's something bubbling along underneath what you're saying, which is this is a candidate that's not raising money. This is a candidate that doesn't really have a campaign manager. It doesn't have a spokesperson who speaks for him. Hope Hicks speaks for the campaign and not for him. He's unliked by large fractions of the elite of the Republican Party. And so there are all these things that are really pretty abnormal. I think reflections of the fact that the Republican Party, at least this year at the national level, is kind of broken. There's something broken about their process. And so for there to be a floor that's above 40% is pretty remarkable. And if that turns out to be true, that I think is a testament to how sharply lines are drawn, where 40% of people will vote for their guy, no matter who that guy is.
So you think like the partisan polarization or the kind of partisan loyalties are so strong in this day and age, it's that much more remarkable as we watch this guy run without any of the trappings of a normal campaign, at least thus far. And from what you're seeing, the electorate still doesn't look that different than it did 4 years ago, at least at this point in the campaign.
I mean, there are places where it looks a little bit different. So if the map gets scrambled at all, it's going to be in deep red states like Utah and Kansas. In the case of Utah, where things are pretty close, there's a big Mormon population there. They don't seem to like the idea of persecuting religious minorities, go figure. And then in Kansas, where there is a survey showing that among decided voters, Hillary Clinton is ahead of Donald Trump in Kansas, and about 20% of voters there are undecided. And so why are they undecided? These are probably Republican voters who just can't quite, they're holding their nose and they're like, yeah, I don't know if I can do that. And so it feels like where there are differences from 4 years ago, it's in places where the states are so Republican that there are divisions within the community as to what it is they look for in a candidate. So, you know, it's amazing. Things are not that different from 4 years ago. And Romney and Trump are, to state the obvious, pretty different people.
Do you think I wonder if it's unique. I mean, you know, if Trump can do this and in the end does relatively well, even if he loses in traditional Republican areas right now, I wonder what that's going to say about campaigning, you know, given how anomalous this whole campaign has been at this point.
Oh, kind of a natural poli-sci experiment.
Yeah.
People talk about campaigns not mattering, but the conditions are, well, sure, when both campaigns are equally matched, then they kind of wrestle each other to a standstill. And sure, campaigns don't matter when both sides are equally equipped. But then when one side kind of disarms, right, where there's sort of the spastic approach to fundraising in which a last-minute email gets sent out and they say they're trying to raise $10,000 and then they realize that's kind of embarrassing, or $100,000, whatever it was. And then they say they're trying to raise $2 million, and then they say they met that goal.
Yeah.
Sure you did. And so there's something a little bit bizarre about the fundraising appeals from the Trump campaign.
I mean, there's this other debate that's interesting is, I mean, kind of why the Republicans who are still saying, you know, I'll vote for the Republican, whoever the candidate is, whether that's because they're loyal to the party, and it doesn't really matter what Trump says, or the other kind of take on it is Trump comes out of Republican politics more than the Republicans want to admit. And even though he has some non-orthodox positions, you know, a lot of what he's doing on immigration, for example, we've seen now for a while building up with the Tea Party. And this reflects the Republican electorate. So then Trump, even though he doesn't have a normal campaign, is actually kind of, you know, playing this trajectory that we've been in, at least since Sarah Palin, but certainly since 2010. I'm not sure where I fall on that, but I do think there's an element of that, you know, where we treat him as too distinct sometimes from where a lot of Republican politics has been.
Sure, I think I see him as being a consequence of where things have gone, say, since Newt Gingrich. If you look at the kinds of tactics that Republicans have been willing to engage in the way they, you know, conduct Congress and the way they deal with the judiciary, they are determined to get policy outcomes. And there's a wing that there's a group of voters that they've really relied upon to be stalwarts in that effort. And one way to look at what's happening this year is that wing of the Republican Party has gotten to the point where they've been promised a bunch of stuff, and their elites have not given it to them. So wait, you told us you were going to do something about immigration. You told us you were going to, you know, indict Hillary, and you were going to do something with Obama, and you were going to do all these other things. And exactly where's my cookie now anyway? And so if you look at these surveys, like about 40% of people on the Republican side supported Trump, from the beginning, from the very beginning in last July, when he declared his candidacy and it seemed kind of improbable, from then till now, he's had about 40% of Republicans in his corner, which is pretty impressive. That's a whole part of the Republican Party that, one way to look at them is that they felt unrepresented by their elites. And if it wasn't Trump, it might have been somebody else.
Does that show up in polling? I mean, obviously that's the big narrative of this whole campaign for both parties. And is there a way to know if that reflects something other than people like myself, writing about this battle between the establishment and a populist insurgency? Can you see evidence in polls that that's what's been going on?
Well, there's been some cool county-by-county analysis based on the American Community Survey that Unwin, I think is his name, or Irwin, sorry, I apologize, Irwin and Josh Katz at the New York Times Upshot have done, where they look to see which county-by-county variables correlate with Trump support. And it's stuff like people who didn't finish high school, counties with lots of people living in mobile homes, counties with lots of jobs in the manufacturing sector, old economy kind of jobs. And if you look, for instance, I've done, one of my readers at the Election Consortium has done her own analysis using Google Correlate to find out which kinds of things show up as being correlated state by state with Trump support. And there are search terms that look like they're from households where the adults in the family don't have internet access. And so it looks like there's this sector of America that shows up in these community surveys where, it's certainly not the case that all Trump supporters are hillbillies, but there is this vibe that comes out here of people who are old economy, less education. The vibe is people who maybe feel left behind. They do not like where their country is going. And it used to be that you could be white and, maybe finish high school and get a job and have a career and buy a house and things would be okay. And that was the 1950s. And something else has happened. President's black, economy's globalizing, and they didn't get what they were promised.
Yeah. I mean, the other part of the 64 election, just looking at it, is obviously that, this is the beginning of the famous backlash against the Democrats. And, the Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act in the summer of 1964. Johnson famously predicted, according to a story, he meets Bill Moyers in the White House after signing the bill, and Moyers doesn't understand why he's so depressed. And Johnson says, "I've just given the South away for generations." And then Goldwater, despite this disastrous election, he does well in parts of the South, which at that point in American history, that was Democratic territory. And, people see that as the beginning of this regional realignment, again, that will happen over the course of the next few decades. But other than the swing states right now, or maybe diminished enthusiasm in Republican states for the Republican candidate, it's unclear there's any block of states that have been Democratic, that have been Republican, that might flip because of Donald Trump in a permanent way.
Yeah.
Right? We're not talking about any states like that at this point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Your example of 1960 to 1964, in that case, it was hard to tell that there was a big realignment because Goldwater lost by such an impressive margin. But if you calculate a thing like the correlation coefficient, state-by-state correlations, which account for waves of support that go up and down and kind of subtract those off. So if you look at state-by-state correlations, there's a striking difference between 1960 and 1964. It's the biggest shift in patterns of how people vote of the last 60 years. In a single election cycle, patterns of how American voters made their choices between the two parties changed by as much as the last 8 presidential elections from now, going back, the last 8 campaigns combined. That was a tectonic shift in how people voted. So contrast that with the last few elections, basically since 2000, vote patterns of preference state by state have not changed that much. There's been remarkable stability. And I think that's probably why we even use the terms red states and blue states, because it's been in the last 4 elections that voting patterns have been stable enough that the maps look kind of familiar. And maybe, if you're a TV person, you just keep the South looking red because that's what you did last time. So I would say other than Kansas and Utah and places like that, the remarkable thing is how little realignment there's been so far from 2012 till now, which is kind of surprising.
But the Republicans seem scared that it could happen. And I mean, at least that's the...
You mean against them?
Against them, right. I mean, they seem clearly this new discussion of shifting financial resources to the Senate and House candidates, basically to protect them with some kind of firewall in case Trump has a bigger effect than everyone's thinking, is at least part of what the Republicans are worried about, you know.
Yeah.
Certainly with the Senate.
I would think of that as another natural experiment where there's been this observation that people like to talk about where the national congressional vote and the national presidential vote tend to be correlated with one another. But again, that could be under normal circumstances. And again, there's this pretty clear crisis in the Republican Party. And it is not the case that most Republicans down ticket are a lot like Donald Trump. And so I think, again, we're going to see a natural experiment where we get to find out how strong that relationship is. And so if Trump loses by the popular vote nationally by 15 percentage points, is it really the case that the congressional vote is going to be like that? And if it is, then the House is going Democratic. But, you know, we'll find out.
Do you think, I mean, like as someone who follows polls, you think, you know, you watch what happened with Brexit, and at least some people argue, I don't know where you are on this, that, you know, people missed what was going on and they didn't anticipate this. And so people then connect that to our election, obviously. Not simply is the support for separating from the union like the Trump support, but are we missing what's going on in the electorate? Because obviously, I think for us, for those who follow what happens at the elite level, how the campaign has worked and who would win the nomination, you know, this election has defied a lot of the conventional wisdom. So all the social scientists said party matters, and that endorsements matter, contributions matter, and that would, you know, overcome flash in the pan media sensations. And Trump has tested that body of social science. You know, people like John Sides have been trying to explain, how do you explain Trump despite what we've been saying? Do you think after Brexit, from a poll perspective, though, there's any chance we're missing something that's going on?
Well, a couple of thoughts there. So the first is that one way to think about the question that social scientists are now facing is to reframe this idea that's called the party decides as a syllogism. So if you say, you know, if P, then Q, and logicians know that if not Q, then evidently not P. And so I think the way to reframe that is a well-functioning political party has mechanisms by which candidates get selected. And that mechanism did not pick Trump. Trump overcame that. And what that suggests is, therefore, the party mechanisms are not well-functioning. There's something broken. And so I would say that it only requires a minor modification of what people were saying before. I think it's good to understand that it's normal mechanisms that lead to that outcome. And at some level, yeah, Brexit might be a little bit the same way, because after all, David Cameron wanted Great Britain to stay in the European Union, evidently didn't get what he wanted. Although I would say, you know, maybe I like polls too much, but I don't see it as such a huge surprise. If you look at the polls the night before the election in the UK, it looked like Remain was ahead of Leave by maybe 1 percentage point. There were equally divided between polls that said Remain would win and Leave would win. And there were 9% of voters in the UK who were undecided. So it's not like it's such a big surprise that that something happened. I mean, you know, it's interesting that a bunch of undecided voters at the last minute may have decided that they wanted to leave the UK, which to my thinking is, you know, that's a big move to decide that your country is going to go leave the European Union after decades of membership. So I think that one lesson I get from that is that I'm not so sure that polls are going to let us down. I think polls are normal measurements, even though politics is so bizarre. So I would say that, you know, my own position is that polls are likely to tell us where things are at. Does Brexit tell us anything about politics otherwise? Well, like I said, I think that is evidently a case where there was a disconnect between what voters wanted and what the parties wanted, because nearly all UK political parties, except for the UK Independence Party, and there was another party whose name I'm not pulling up in the moment, but a minor party. But basically, the major parties wanted the UK to stay in the European Union. Labour had wanted it. Conservatives' stated position was that. The Scottish Nationalist Party wanted it. So, there was something voters wanted that the parties were not delivering. So that's kind of reminiscent of the Republican Party in the US.
It'll be interesting to see, how all of this affects the policy agenda of the parties when this is over. I mean, certainly from my perspective with the Republicans, everything you're just talking about at least suggests the party needs to rethink where its policies are, if it's going to deal with what supported Trump. You've had this disconnect in the GOP between parties, policies that are pretty regressive on economics, and yet they've built this coalition with working and middle-class Americans. And the what's the matter with Kansas argument was that they went along with it on cultural issues. But I think a lot of people have been writing, there's this real fragility to the coalition that seems to be unfolding right now. And it'll be interesting if the GOP, at least, and we can talk about the Democrats another time, if they, realign some of what they've been pushing for. But that will clash with a lot of their core supporters who have no interest in, abandoning free trade or, increasing taxes or any of the actual issues that are on the table right now.
Well, there's more than two ways to look at the whole combination of issues that we care about in the United States. And so at some level, it's amazing that we have two political parties, right? It's this winner-take-all system that forces everybody to choose up sides. And so if you look at the history of party alignments in the US, it seems like about every 50 years or so, on average, there's some kind of realignment in which either one party or both parties change who they are. And so, it wouldn't be surprising if we were due for a change. And I would argue that maybe, with things like the government shutdown. I mean, one way to look at the shutdowns of both 1994 and also 2 years ago in 2014 is that one party was not getting what it wanted by regular mechanisms, and they were willing to do what it took to get something resembling what they wanted. And if it involved shutting it all down, that's what they were going to do. And so I think, to put it mildly, that is not political mechanisms working as usual. And, for some people, that's a good thing.
Yeah. The one thing we haven't discussed, although we're almost out of time, the other factor here is obviously Hillary Clinton. And, in 64, Lyndon Johnson was phenomenally popular at the time of the election. I can't remember his approval ratings, but I think they're at 60 or 60 plus. And he's the guy running, in contrast to saying Obama's popular. Whereas I wonder how Hillary Clinton's, at least mediocre popularity at best will affect some of the potential for shifts in states, or how that will affect support for Trump, even in some of these Republican areas. I think that'll be pretty important.
Yeah.
And that landslide was built on where Johnson was early in his presidency.
Well, where he was early on in his presidency was, it was within a year of the Kennedy assassination, which was just a seismic event. I mean, the only thing that in my lifetime that I can think of that compares to that would be 9/11. Right, where George W. Bush was riding this phenomenal wave of popularity and approval that arose from the whole country having to come together around a singular event. So obviously Hillary Clinton doesn't have that. I think everybody would like her not to have that, because that would involve some singular event between now and November, and probably nobody wants that. So yeah, it's interesting that she is relatively unpopular. That could be because of factors specific to her, or it could be because of polarization in politics, where major figures in a party get torn down. And the battle lines have been drawn pretty sharply ever since 2000. And, maybe any Democrat at the top of the ticket would have a similar problem. So, but yeah, I think that her relative unpopularity compared with past Democrats is something to watch.
Well, that actually wraps up our first episode. So I hope everyone can join us next week when we continue our discussion. And so thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Politics.